Now, going over into the starting of the Azov Battalion, which is very, don't miss, regardless of what you think about how that worked out with Gonzalo, and whether there's more to the story or the lies, it's all made up. There's plenty of theories floating around, which I don't know how anybody would know for sure. The Azov Battalion was involved in that because they spoke up. They tweeted on their accounts with their Azov Battalion patches on, and they tried to delete it. And we got the Wayback Machine that showed them saying it's very clear. That was the boatsman guy, the one claiming that they had him, which the story goes, at least, they ended up having him. So this is not a secret that they were very clearly there and very clearly involved and argued about beheading and everything else. So my point is that this group right now, as I've said many times, is very big. Not just, and the Azov Battalion is what it is called the Azov movement now. And it even says this in this 2019 article, because it's more than just the battalion. It's a movement. It's political parties. They have radio stations. I mean, this group is huge. The Azov movement. And they're influential. They operate alongside the police, if not influential, completely overtaking the police forces, the interior of the ministry, the National Guard. They've got political parties, right? This is all about this. Why I say it's immersed throughout the government. And guess what? That's exactly what they say here and in the Time Magazine article next, right before we got to this point. So how can they be so fully immersed and controlling everything, and then on December 25th, they went back to being non-existent? I mean, that's just embarrassing, right? Because these same outlets are now saying that. But let's get into this. This is 2019. This is the first one. I actually just found this an hour or so before we got started and went through it pretty quickly and highlighted some stuff because it's really about this article that I wanted to get into. Somebody just sent me this. Like, share, recruit. How a white supremacist militia, and it's interesting that they use literally white supremacists because they're not doing that now. They're calling them alt-right extremists, kind of like watering it down because they obviously are embarrassed by their defending of this to start. And now it's obvious that they're not. It's just, I keep imagining what these people must be going through. The person, let's say, that doesn't really know the agenda and just loves to think they're in the right because they think they know everything because they're in the Western press. And they just yell you down and say, you conspiracy theorist, Putin's the Nazi. You don't know what you're talking about. And now it's pretty stupidly obvious that they are very obviously. And so that person's probably going, what? Like, are we fighting white supremacy, or how am I defending this? Like, you got to think in their mind how they're rationalizing openly defending an open neo-Nazi group while they pretend they're fighting white supremacy around the world. It's just childishly stupid. But I imagine at some level, these people are having a hard time with it. I'd argue most of them either don't care, aren't smart enough, or are part of it, but I'll let you decide. But how a white supremacist militia uses Facebook to radicalize and train new members. This 2014? No. 2016? No. 19? No. 2021. This was like not even a full year ago, guys. This is ridiculous. Or technically, no, it would be more a year and so many months. So are we going to pretend that they can have an international reach and their white supremacist militia using all the and training people around the world, and then suddenly, less than a year later, they just go back to being non-existent? It's pretty silly. But let's go through this right here first. Is America training neo-Nazis in Ukraine? Here's what's funny. If an independent media outlet said this right now, they'd be like, you're so stupid. You're a Nazi. You're a racist. What do you mean? How dare you? It's all Putin, right? It's just funny how so quickly this can evolve. It says officially no, but no one in the U.S. government seems to know for sure. This is December 2019. There are no doubts about, I love the start here, no doubts about the neo-Nazi white supremacist background of the Azov Battalion. Now, they are sort of admitting that right now. They weren't at first. Now they're kind of going, well, it's a background. It's back in 2014, but they've evolved since then, which is kind of one of the arguments this one at least tries to make but fails. But at the end of the day, it's clear that even the writer was like, it's pretty obvious that this is not what's happening. But it goes on to say, a militia that has positioned itself, 2019, at the forefront of the fight against Russia-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine, which don't forget, that's the point they don't want you to think about now, is that these dangerous people who they are openly calling neo-Nazi white supremacists as of 2021 are the ones that have been on the front lines hurting people in Donbass. Like, imagine the mental gymnastics it takes to think that white supremacy is so serious that you are attacking your own military and half the country because they're everywhere and they're doing this. They're so dangerous we can't even let them exist. Except now over here, we're not going to point out that they are the same thing and could have done dangerous things that you admit that they're just ubiquitous in those circles because you want to Russia bad guy. Are we going to pretend that these are not neo-Nazis or that they didn't commit war crimes against these people? Like, it's just such an obvious hypocritical stance because it's verified. Those people admitted to doing so. You can look on Wikipedia right now, and the citation is from the Ukrainian government that says they killed 14,000 people in Donbass. Not on both sides, but they killed in Donbass. And then when we point that out, we get called conspiracy theorists. As the funder, oh, excuse me, it goes on to say, as the founder and head of the battalion, who we've already referenced to you, Andriy Beletsky, once put it, and you've heard this many times, the historic mission of our nation in this critical moment is to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade for their survival. And they leave off the part where he says, and get rid of all the inhumans, or I'll reference it in the next article, that Russian President Vladimir Putin and his propagandists exploit this fact. I love how this works out. Like, so today it's that they're lying about it, lying about the Nazis because they want to manipulate you, right? But it's just like with 2016 and anything else. They're using facts to manipulate you. Well, that is certainly possible, but usually that means it's facts with more lies, right? So you're using one true thing and a lot of other lies, but that's not what they're saying. Sort of like with the WikiLeaks documents. They didn't give us a lot of lies along with it. No. They gave you all facts, and they just said that those facts are being used against you by the Russian government. Well, it doesn't really seem like that's what's happening. They're showing you the truth about who you are. Now, yeah, that is being used against you, but we have every right to see it because you're lying to us. Same thing here. Today, it's not even real, but back then, it's a fact. But he's using that fact to exploit the situation. Now, that's even certainly true or possible. But don't miss that they're acknowledging the fact that these people are open white supremacy, neo-Nazi militias that have overtaken the government. I'll get into that more in a second. Using that fact to build support for their aggression and to undermine the international effort to help Ukraine defend its independence is undeniable. The independence that's being wrought and controlled by white supremacists. Okay, now he's using that fact to undermine that independence. It's a weird stance to take, isn't it? But knowing that and wanting to resist that does not resolve some very important questions about the basic facts. You would never see an article written like this right now. What is the relationship of the U.S. government to these people? Is it training them? Yes, it is. Might it arm them? It already has. Is this like the Afghan War of the 1980s? Exactly like that. One of those cases where we aid and abet the kind of monsters who eventually become our enemies? Exactly. Or get framed as the enemy, just like they did with the Kurds, like they did with Saddam Hussein, like they did with Osama bin Laden, right? Where they're the biggest chief ally of the government right up until they're the worst enemy alive. Now, what's interesting is they try to frame this as the government like being a clumsy idiot that just doesn't realize what they're doing. I completely disagree with that. I think this is a choice, and I think that's very clear based on the data, the documents, that they've built this for a purpose. Not that they just funded them because bad guy Russia, and then, oops, we forgot to do something about them, and now they're our enemy. That's how they frame Afghanistan, too. I don't believe that's what happened. I think they built this Mujahideen army and then left it because they didn't care, but knew that it would always be something that would kind of harry the Soviet Union and now Russia on the border because it was just present. But that became the impetus for everything else. That became Al-Qaeda, which became ISIS, which became their growing war on terror. Weird how that war on terror only grew the thing, because that was always the point. Same thing today. And they're blaming it on you, just like they did then. Concerns about that possibility have been growing on Capitol Hill. Now, you know this because we've talked about it. More than once, the Congress has reached out to the government saying, why are we helping these people? Probably, as I always point out, because people in Congress aren't in the know. They think they are. Just like the people on the news, they don't really know what's going on. Some of them sure do, but it's usually decentralized. Like these people, even at the really high level insight, don't fully understand the picture. That's how this stuff works. But because of uncertainty surrounding the Azov Battalion's role in the U.S. training initiative and worries about the possible supply of shoulder-held anti-aircraft missiles to such characters, the House unanimously adopted bipartisan amendments, the Department of Defense Appropriations Act of 2015, and one of them specifically blocks training of the Ukrainian neo-Nazi paramilitary militia Azov Battalion. Representatives John Connors and Ted Yoho sponsored the amendment of the bill, which has passed unanimously by Congress. Oh, and they just moved forward. Well, isn't it interesting that back in 2019, when they wrote this article, they somehow managed to miss in all of their extensive due diligence like less than a year later, the Pentagon removed that? Like, how can you write that and then leave that part out? It's 2019, guys. Now, yes, in 2018, they added it back, but the point is they still continue to fund them, which even this article points out. But it's interesting is they just make the argument that, well, they just put a block as if that's where the conversation ended. There's just not, these are the people that are supposed to be trusted. Either he doesn't know what he's looking for or doesn't care. But the point is, guys, think about this. If even then, 2016, 2018, they said, we can't arm these people. And we go forward to prove to you that they are not just the same, but even worse today, even worse as of 2021, let alone right now. And yet they're the defenders of Mariupol. They're obviously being armed. I mean, you don't defend them without weapons. Where the weapons are coming from, the Western countries, NATO countries, predominantly the United States, coming right now. And even then, if you pretend that they're not handing them directly to them, they're still going directly to them from the Ukrainian government. That's what this article makes very clear. So why is that acceptable? If we were so afraid of them arming them that we 2 different times we put blocks, but now we just ignore that, and I'll get to it in a minute, that don't forget that amendment is still there. And yet they're breaking the law, which is the point of the title today. They are breaking their own law, which they do all the time, to arm neo-Nazis. It's incredible. But that stuff doesn't matter in the psychosis, what's the right word, enveloped world that we live in. But it says, because of the uncertainties around them, they put this in there. And then took it out less than a year later, and then added it back in 2018. But the highly problematic truth is that the U.S. government currently has no way of ensuring that members of neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion, who are now cheering on, are not being trained by U.S. forces, because most, if not all, have not committed a gross human rights violation. I don't know how you would even possibly know that. Even more difficult to determine is whether ex-U.S. military are training crypto-Nazis in a private capacity. Right, because that's happening. What they're kind of saying is that it's difficult to determine whether they're training the bad guys. Don't miss what they're admitting to you right there. They are training them. What they're quibbling about is whether we're training the bad guys too. Do you realize that right now they're pretending this is not true? That we haven't been there training them, that we've been sending things from other places? It was on the damn record, guys. They've been there. The CIA foreign policy article admits it themselves, both in 2015 and later, I think it was the same year, but another deployment of CIA specifically, actual armed personnel. But we're talking about the fact that they know they're training them, they know they're arming them, but they're concerned about them going to the bad guys. It's just absolutely astounding that this can be so contradictory to what they're screaming is the fact right now. In an interview with the Daily Beast, Sergeant Ivan Kharkiv of the Azov Battalion talks about his battalion's experience with U.S. trainers and U.S. volunteers quite fondly, even mentioning U.S. volunteers, engineers, and medics that are still currently assisting them. That's how obvious this is. They've been there alongside them, which I keep telling everybody, since 2015 on the record. I'm sure it was long before that, but don't miss that the Azov Battalion really was created by the regime change revolution created by NATO and the United States in Ukraine in 2014. That's where they got really created. So my point is that's from there forward when the CIA stepped in and cultivated them, armed them, grew them, trained them, and here we are. But don't forget as well, before that, from 1948, as far as I can tell forward, the CIA was also doing the same thing. He says, as for the training, they have and continue to receive numerous foreign armed forces, right? This is U.S. government, UK, they've been trained, armed, and supported for a long time. Those U.S. officials involved in the vetting process obviously have instructions to say that U.S. forces are not training Azov Battalion as such. They're calling them liars right in plain day. It says they also say that Azov members are screened out, yet no one seems to know precisely how that's done. In fact, given the way the Ukrainian government operates, it's almost impossible. And this is the truth, guys. So there's lip service to the fact that, yeah, we weed them out using the Leahy, what's the term they use? It's down there. I'll point out in a second. The Leahy process is right there, based on Congressman Leahy. The point being that you're supposed to vet them and make sure. And one of the biggest points of this article, which I think is very transparent to where it would go, is that we can vet for human rights violations, which would only mean that you would know they've committed them, which I don't know how you would know they've committed them if they weren't caught, but we can't weed out ideology. That's one of the big pushes. I think that was the point of this article. Yeah, they're bad. They always wanted you to know they're bad, but they just didn't want you to know the CIA did it. But what's interesting to me is that if they're going, we can't weed out ideology, and they make the point very clearly more than once in this article, just like we can't in the U.S. military. They can join. We don't know if they're neo-Nazis. Wink, wink. That, I think, was the whole point of this. Because then when all of a sudden you pretend that Russia is the impetus for why the Azov Battalion grew in Ukraine, well, you can make this big tie back to them. And that's not a secret. That's not my thought. That's on the record that they've tried to lay this at the feet of Russia with the Russian imperial movement and so on, which is a dangerous group, but is no even remotely close to the groups that have been tied directly to what we're talking about. And the evidence is threadbare in regard to the Russian imperial movement tied to Ukraine specifically. But in the other case, on the other side of it, you can show just a mountain of evidence of CIA training of this group and then grabbing specifically US ties, UK ties, and making that this international group. But weirdly, continually trying to lay the crumbs back to Russia. It's interesting. So the Leahy process is more the big problem now because, well, we don't know. How do we weed out ideology? Well, we have a solution for that, right? That's what you would expect next. But it's almost impossible to know. So bottom line is, I know this is an agenda. I know it. That's my opinion, but I feel it in my bones. But at the end of the day, what I'm pointing out here is that they, even on the surface narrative, they don't even know. So that means they're for sure sending in weapons, training, and arms, and everything else, and it's going directly into the arms of the Azov Battalion because there's no way to even know. Because as the article makes clear, the Azov Battalion, or rather everybody they train, comes directly from the Ukrainian Ministry of Interior, which, by the way, is the Azov Battalion. And they make that clear in this article too. So everybody they train comes from like a mishmash of people coming from the interior, and they admit themselves, some of them may have be Azov, we don't even know. So basically what you have is a loophole where they know all we got to do is just mix them together, send them in groups, and nobody really knows who's being trained. They can pretend like they don't know. It's called plausible deniability. When officials are asked for details of any kind regarding how the vetting process actually functions, answers are ambiguous, details are scarce, and the explanations become contradictory, because that's what normally happens when you're telling the truth, right? This is mainstream media, guys. In an interview with the Daily Beast, the U.S. Army Public Affairs officer from the 173rd Airborne Brigade training Ukrainian forces, when asked about members of the Azov Battalion who have not committed gross human abuses, more specifically how they are screened out, he says, that's actually a great question. It's one the State Department would need to answer, which is pretty telling, but even more so when you get to the part where he asks that person directly. Now, it says, Ferentzevich confirms that it is practically impossible to know which trainees are from which battalion. Quote, it's a mishmash of folks, volunteers, soldiers, war heroes, maiden veterans, right? Directly from the big impetus of where they actually started. I mean, I couldn't tell you, sort of investigating the background of each guy. Yeah, isn't that the point? Short of investigating the background. So we're not vetting them then because it would be hard to do that because we'd have to vet each person. That's really? So what do you mean? You're just looking at them and going, you look like a good guy. Go on ahead. If you're not investigating the background of each individual, there's no vetting process. Like, that's just ridiculous. But it goes, at this point, she recommends that we speak to the press officer of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. This is a person from the embassy in the Ukraine embassy, the United States embassy in Ukraine. They explain that he actually directed us to her. She laughs, and they go, welcome to the U.S. government. That's the scarecrow pointing in both directions. So the 173rd Airborne Brigade says, go talk to the U.S. government. The U.S. government says, go talk to the Airborne Brigade. They both laugh, and nobody gets any answers. The point is, that's how it works, guys. They lie, and they obfuscate, and you never get any real answers. Regarding the Ukrainian government's involvement in the vetting process, Captain Modungo explains that one section of the government is doing all the heavy lifting. Quote, I believe it's the Ministry of Interior that is picking companies to come here. Really? So we pretend that we're vetting, and the person vetting is the Azov Battalion. So I wonder if the Azov Battalion is vetting out the Azov Battalion. What do you think? Like, this is just a game of names, like Hayat al-Sham is no longer ISIS. Yes, they are. They just changed the name. This is ridiculous. If the Ministry of Interior is the one picking who goes in, well, they're letting in who they want, which is the Azov Battalion. That's very clear. And as I say right here, the Azov Battalion not only answers directly to the Interior Minister, but is integrated deeply in that structure. Exactly. The founder and head of the Azov, Andrei Beletsky, who right now is currently back in the leadership, is a really, really obvious neo-Nazi war criminal. And I believe they say it later in this article. Oh, and the next one, actually. And it says, this is an issue that simply needs more attention than I don't know from the United States government. Remember, this is 2019. Even those most closely connected to the process seem unclear on the specifics of it. You know why? Because there's not a process. This is a CIA operation building a very dangerous group just like they did in Syria to be used against you, against the world, however they're going to use this. If you pretend for a second they care how bad these people really are, then you don't understand what they're trying to accomplish. They want the people that are disgusting because that's what they've always done. That's not my opinion. History is right there, guys. Pick up a book and look for it. It's clear. Now, even then, you should be questioning whether that is, I mean, as always, I've said, history is written by the winning hand. Just take it with some discernment. That's life. That's always the case. It's not just what we're saying. That's the problem, is that people would rather put their head in the sand than recognize how frustrating the reality can be. That sometimes you do need to walk away going, I don't know, or realize that the information could be lies, or, whatever else. But the history of what's collectively agreed upon is pretty obvious, guys, that they have continued to arm and fund the worst people. This says the problem is that the Azov battalion is nuzzled so deeply into the Ukrainian government, that they are nearly impossible to weed out. That statement in 2019 directly contradicts what they're saying now. Now, sure, could they have changed from then until 2022? Sure. To pretend that back then they were so completely immersed in the government that it was impossible to weed out, but then they just did that until 2021? No, because that's not what happened. As even I'll show you next, they don't make this argument. This is 2022 or 2021, January. So a year and 4 months ago. Like, share, recruit. Now, one of the important parts here is to show you how Facebook, despite their narrative, have been an integral part in allowing this structure to be built. Even they repeatedly say, without Facebook, we would never want to be able to do this. Now, that could have been malfeasance, clumsy incompetence, or it could have been the exact thing you might think it is. The intelligence community using these outlets just like we know that they do. So here's what it says. January 7th, 2021. When they finally rendezvoused, Fuller noticed that swastika tattoo on the middle finger of Fulham Horn's left hand. And this person was a Army veteran from the U.S. going to join the Azov battalion. It didn't surprise him. The recruiter for that group had made no secret of his neo-Nazi politics. Within the global network of far-right extremists, he served as a point of contact to the Azov movement. They won't even say that today because they don't want to pretend it's a movement. They want to pretend it's a really small battalion militia group that's no longer really there, or they got dispersed amongst them. That's an old story. 2021. Yes, it's a movement because it's not just a battalion, it's a political group, it's TV. I mean, they control and have influence over damn near everything in this country, as this article is going to tell you. The point is, he served as a point of contact to the Azov movement, the Ukrainian militant group that has trained and inspired white supremacists from around the world, and which he's come to join. But apparently, with a little more than a year later, it just somehow doesn't exist anymore and never did. How did that work, right? Or I shouldn't say never did, but dissipated after 2015. How can you have an international network that we're so afraid of, that's influencing U.S. people and all this different stuff, if the narrative they're spinning today? But Azov is much more than a militia, they say. It has its own political party, two publishing houses, so media, summer camps for children, and a vigilante force known as the National Militia, which, of course, patrols the streets of Ukrainian cities alongside the police. Oh, yeah, just a small little thing that's no longer there. Unlike its ideological peers in the U.S. and Europe, it also has a military wing with at least 2 training bases and a vast arsenal of weapons, from drones and armored vehicles to artillery pieces, which you'll find out all come from predominantly the U.S. government. What's interesting is that how in the world do you make this about Russia? Right? Why would they be laying this groundwork if it was all clearly tied back to the U.S. government? Well, obviously, that's not what happened, because once that got exposed, the narrative changed on a dime. Now, you can see how this would be building, right? How this could be built and eventually go, oh, look, it's the Russian imperial movement that's or whatever else they want to frame it as. Otherwise, how do you explain why they would be training this and then also promoting the idea that they're growing this network? This is that whole, we see this growing and we just don't know how to stop it. Well, you do. You stop funding it. You stop doing it, obviously. But they keep floating these narratives. For those that don't remember, I just played this the other day.
The world is changing, and every counterterrorism professional I speak to in the federal government and overseas feels like we are at the doorstep of another 9/11, maybe not something that catastrophic in terms of the visual or the numbers, but that we can see it building and we don't quite know how to stop it.
And then remember that January 6th happened right after, right? Now, what's interesting, though, is you're pointing out this rising white supremacy threat. And what do they reference? That's what they're actually talking about in that meeting. What do they actually reference when they get into that? Charlottesville, right? Christchurch, Rise Above movement. Like, how can we miss the obvious connection? They specifically reference those groupings. And then when you find out that those groupings are directly tied to the Azov Battalion, and then we prove the CIA has been the one actually funding and arming them, as we just saw, like quasi-admitted by the Daily Beast, even though it's very clear now. How does that even make sense? Why would they be framing themselves? They're not. I think they bungled the narrative, and I think at the end of the day, this was meant to be laid somewhere else. It says, outside Ukraine, Azov occupies a central role in a network of extremist groups stretching from California across Europe to New Zealand, according to law enforcement officials on 3 continents. I mean, that one sentence completely challenges every single thing being stated by the entirety of the corporate media. How dumb is that? Ali Soufan, a securities consultant and former FBI agent, who we've referenced the FBI's discussion of this point, who has studied Azov, this FBI agent who has studied them, estimates in 2021, in January, that more than 17,000 foreign fighters have gone to Ukraine over the past 6 years from 50 countries. So then how in the world, if this is what they're stating, and they all know this, and the FBI even backs it up, did they go a year later to only 1,100? And don't forget, we just pointed out that one of the other discussions that was way closer to 2022 discussed 50,000 more. They're lying to you. That's why, because for some reason, they got the aggressive narrative push from somebody above to downplay this discussion. The vast majority, that's my opinion, the vast majority have no apparent links to far-right ideology, they say. But as Soufan looked into the recruitment methods of Ukraine's more radical militias, he found an alarming pattern. It reminded him of Afghanistan in the late 1990s, after Soviet forces withdrew and the U.S. failed to fill the security vacuum. Now, that's not what happened, not even remotely. That's how they they pretend like we can't pull out because of the vacuum. That's not the reality. The vacuum is created when you destroy literally everything and any infrastructure and then back away, which in this case, you could make that argument, but like Syria, that's not what would have happened. That's the narrative they spin. And in this case, why that's not the same is because they built this group. They're the ones that created the problem, and then they pretend that's what filled the vacuum. No, you just created it and left. The vacuum was already filled by your actions. But pretty soon, the extremists took over. The Taliban was in charge. Right. The group they made deals with recently. It's silly. And we do not wake up until 9/11, Soufan tells Time. This is the parallel now with Ukraine. Even ties to 9/11, ties to Afghanistan, ties to the whole point. But it's interesting to say the vast majority have no links to far-right ideology. So what he's essentially implying is exactly what I was saying, that it's not necessarily about the fact that they're all radicalized extremists, but they're using those people as the kind of the fodder, and the people leading this are more so about the agenda. That's how I see this. Either way, he's making the exact claim that these people are dangerous and you've just left them to their devices. Even if you believe that's what happened, isn't that still the fault of the US government? Yes, but I don't think that's the full story. It says September 2019, 40 members of Congress, 40 members. Actually, where was that compared to this? September 2019, this was December. Okay, so this would have been before this article was written, right? So before that, months before, 40 members of Congress signed a letter calling, unsuccessfully, of course, for the U.S. State Department to designate Azov a foreign terrorist organization. So you're telling me you can have explicit statements calling them out in name, which I'll show you in a minute. Can't arm or train the Azov Battalion in their omnibus bill. But yet you quibble about designating them a foreign terrorist group, despite the fact that you guys are screaming in every article everywhere that they have international white supremacy reach. Why does that make sense? Because something changes when you designate them an organization like that. Azov has been recruiting, quote, Azov has been recruiting, radicalizing, and training American citizens for years, the letter said. Yeah, that's exactly the point. And that doesn't tie back to some organic white supremacy conservative uprising. It points back to a CIA illusion being created to be blamed on them. Now, Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI at the time, later confirmed in testimony to the U.S. Senate that American white supremacists are, quote, actually traveling overseas to train. Now, why would he admit that if he knows that there's an obvious connection back to the U.S. government? because they don't want you to know that part. Time, in more than a dozen interviews with Azov's leaders and recruits, it's funny how they'll scream and like freak out. How dare you can't interview Russia because that's normalizing them. But here they are interviewing with open extremist white supremacist groups. Like, that's okay though. How childish. Time is more than a dozen interviews. The point is they should interview anybody because that's what's supposed to happen, or diplomacy should be with anybody. Time, in more than a dozen interviews with Azov's leaders and recruits, found that the key to its international growth that doesn't exist today has been its pervasive use of social media. Well, look at that, especially Facebook, which has struggled to keep the group off its platform. Facebook is the main channel, the recruiter said. Yes, exactly. The point is, even then, they pretended like they were censoring them, but they really weren't. It was an illusion because they used it predominantly to grow the entire thing, even after they were supposed to be censored on Facebook. As they said back then, we put a ban on their name until they updated it recently and said, well, now we'll allow them to say this. Why? It's still the same group. This is 2021. They're still the same white supremacy group you guys were all screaming about. And suddenly you think that they're the defenders of Mariupol and you're allowed to talk about them now? How does that possibly happen? Because we destroyed the narrative. Goes on to say, even in December, the Azov movement's political wing, the National Core, and its youth wing maintained at least a dozen pages on Facebook. Some began disappearing after Time, of course, pointed them out and said, you're lying about this. Oh, they deleted them real quick. Clearly, they're being allowed on there. They're using Facebook and social media. Now, do not miss the connection back to the big push for why we need to continue to censor, because democracy, as if that's actually not completely counterintuitive. Because all of this ties directly back to the things they're trying to push. Now, that's why I can understand why people who don't watch these shows but kind of read the titles and think what they think I'm talking about are very concerned about that. I get the agenda, and I see it too, but I am not promoting that agenda. I'm promoting the real story underneath it, which shows you how your government built it to use against you, which is why I wrote this, or this one, in fact, or rather about January 6th, the failed false flag meant to blame Russia and you using the CIA-grown Azov Battalion, or how the CIA built the new Al-Qaeda in Ukraine. It's about manipulating the situation. The Azov movement, through its online propaganda, has fueled, according to Time magazine in 2021, a global ideology of hate that now inspires more terrorist attacks on the U.S. than Islamist extremism does, and is a growing threat throughout the Western world. Now, that's not even remotely true, in my opinion, based on just what we see reported. Like, that's just not, well, I mean, you could look at it two ways. One, first of all, how many Islamic attacks do we see in the country? Pretty much none, which is interesting. Like in the context of like the bigger, like some kind of a group in the Middle East coming over and attacking the United States. I don't even know where that's realistically happened. So then when you get like one thing in Charlottesville, they go, way more, have inspired far more attacks than this. And that's, okay, one more, or, you could see how that could be manipulated for propaganda. But nonetheless, the point is, what I'm trying to show you is how before they was exposed, the CIA was tied to this. They were trying to get you to see how it's everywhere and they're growing and it's a global grouping that's growing and we can't control it. Where it's building and we just don't know how to stop it, right? That's the same thing they were pointing at. After the worst such attack in recent years, of course, here's where we get into the references I'm pointing out, the massacre of 51 people in Christchurch, New Zealand, 2019, an arm of the Azov movement helped distribute the terrorist manifesto. How is it not possible that we can't see the connection to every single one of the things they're claiming as the impetus for the U.S. version of the growing white supremacy threat ties directly to the Azov Battalion? I don't mean like abstractly, directly. They were sharing his manifesto, intentionally seeking to glorify his claims, inspiring others. And of course, on top of that, remember, he was wearing the patch on his arm. In their letter to State Department in 2019, U.S. lawmakers noted that, quote, the link between Azov and acts of terror in America is clear. And yet now you're funding and arming them and allowing them to fight in Ukraine. How do you make sense of that? You don't, is the point. You either pretend this article isn't here because fake news or whatever you want to tell yourself, or you acknowledge that there's a contradictory action happening here. You can't have both. It's not like in the process of a year, they literally became something different. That's ridiculous. And by the way, it's on the record, not even true. But the point is that how can you see that and not see that you're being lied to? Or, I mean, at the very least, if you want to take it at face value, ask yourself why it would make sense that you can scream that they're literally responsible for acts of terror inside this country, like what they referenced in Charlottesville and whatever else, and yet they're okay to be cheered on by Facebook right now, or you're allowed to arm them, or they're the defenders of Mariupol. It just doesn't make sense. Among Azov's closest American allies has been the Rise Above movement. Exactly. Of their closest allies, which was the big point that grew the discussion of the white supremacy threat that was laid at the feet of Donald Trump. It even says that in this article. A far-right gang, some of whose members were charged by the FBI with a series of violent attacks in California. The group's leader, we've already discussed, Robert Rundo, has said his idea for the Rise Above movement came from Ukraine's far-right scene. He said, quote, "This is always my whole inspiration for everything." He told a right-wing podcast in September 2017, referring specifically to the Azov Battalion as the future. This is not just a coincidental thing. They really have the culture out there, he said. Quote, "They have their own clubs, they have their own bars, they have their own dress style." It says the main recruitment center for Azov Battalion, Azov movement, known as the Cossack House, guess what? Stands right in the center of Kiev. Not just Mariupol, not just one small militia group, the Azov movement, international scope, and a huge recruiting center on top of all of it, you know, aside from their publication outlets where they produce media, is in the center of Kiev. So maybe there was truth to Putin trying to push into Kiev, and they, you know, who knows? The point is that that's not what we're being told by the Western press. On the ground floor is a shop called the Militant Zone, which, by the way, guys, this is right now, by the way. Okay, so this is a huge group in the center of Kiev. And in the store they have, in the recruitment center and the store they have in that recruitment center, according to Time Magazine, has a shop called the Militant Zone, which sells clothes and keychains with swastikas and other neo-Nazi merchandise. Okay, this is one of those points where you have to go, okay, this is not just some hypothetical thing from 4 years ago or whatever you want to frame it as. If right now, in the middle of this whole thing, they have a store, or at least before whatever happened in the area, if this was affected by it, if they're selling neo-Nazi and swastika keychains, this is not some side small thing of, you know, whether he has different ideology. This is an immersed concept amongst their group at the very least. That's clear. And it says, right, as you can see, on a tour of the Cossack House, the Time Magazine said Azov's mission was to form a coalition of the far right across the Western world with the ultimate aim of taking power throughout Europe. Maybe some of these European leaders should think about that for a second and realize that they might be next. It might seem ironic for this hub of white nationalists to be situated in Ukraine. Here's the interesting part that we're hearing today. At one point in 2019, it was the only nation in the world, apart from Israel, to have a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister. Think about that. But in the context of the white supremacist movement globally, Azov has no rivals on two important fronts: its access to weapons and its recruiting power. Oh, I guess we're just going to skip right past that whole point about the Jewish president. Yeah, at one point, it was the only one that have it. Moving forward, it's like, okay. So if you're out there screaming that this isn't true, even though literally the same media outlets are saying it's true right here, because you have a Jewish president, you're stupid. Because not only is it obvious that shouldn't even make a difference, seeing as how that wasn't something that stopped Jewish people from assisting the Nazis in World War II, or I mean, there's a lot of different things we've talked about. It's just a stupid argument that's meant to make people look racist by calling them racist because they dare to say the truth. The bottom line is, whether or not he's Jewish, the point is that that's very clearly what they say that they are. So and they're even pointing it out right here. The movement arose as a product of the revolution that swept Ukraine in 2014. Exactly. So the U.S.-backed regime change that made this happen, and which they knew were U.S. government-backed entities that were shooting people, and they blamed it on the other side. That's what started this movement. Shocking, I know. A CIA-backed revolution became the impetus for the CIA-backed group. Oh, weird. In one of their first official acts after that, the U.S.-backed regime change, the revolution leaders granted amnesty to 23 prisoners, including several prominent far-right agitators. They included, guess who? Beletsky, an open neo-Nazi entity who has spent the previous 2 years in jail on charges of attempted murder. He maintained that the case against him was politically motivated as part of an unfair crackdown and blah, blah, blah. Okay, the point is, that person came back in 2014. Then he left, I forget what the date was, 16, 17. And they said, see, that's when it all changed. He went away and he's no longer part of it, except now he's back in the leadership right this moment. As we pointed out the other day, here's the Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation discussing the Azov Battalion, last updated 2022. I might make points in this as we go forward. I forget if there's anything else in here, but of course, just showing you where is it? Leadership. He's right there at the top. Now, of course, this doesn't reference the part that he came back into it, but it does discuss it up in here about the fact that he now is presently back in the group. It's on the record. They just don't really focus on it, right? Because they want to pretend, just like when they go, we blocked the weapons sales. No, you didn't. It came right back, but you don't point at that part of it. Goes on to say that he spent years in jail. He maintained that the case, okay, then it goes on to say Beletsky's nickname within the group, don't forget, he's currently in the leadership, was White Ruler. That was his nickname. And his manifesto seemed to pluck its narrative straight from Nazi ideology. Ukrainian nationalists, it said, must, quote, lead the white nations of the world in a final crusade of their survival, a crusade against the Semite-led German term for subhumans. Here's where I got this picture from, by the way, and just don't, the point of showing this was, one, that these are all open Wolf's Angel symbols as the Azov Battalion always uses, but they have a couple of neo-Nazi symbols on their shirts, but also the child being marched along with them, but also, of course, this very clear swastika adaptation on this guy's hat. No big deal. It's not like it's right on the surface and anything. Now, and of course, here is Time Magazine in 2021 acknowledging what their CNN plays a big game about, saying, no, it's an N and an I because they say so. No, they're telling you right here. Their banners carry the emblem derived from the Nazi symbol, the Wolf's Angel. But now we don't know for sure. Through speeches and propaganda videos posted on YouTube and widely shared on Facebook, the Azov movement began to cultivate an online profile and a distinctive aesthetic. Through YouTube and Facebook. It's weird they didn't use Gab and TikTok or whatever else you want to point at, right? Why didn't they use Parler? Isn't that where they all go? No, these are just these couch stupid narratives like Subi was pointing out, where you're fighting a hollow argument that's not even really there. They're creating fake things and pretending like that's everything. YouTube and Facebook allowed this to grow. They know that. That's why they're there. They're using these things. And then they couch them in places like Gab and act like that's everything. Just like we pointed out before, during things like Charlottesville and whatever else. That's when they went after these groups, pretending like that's where they all spoke. Except you could find the exact same shared content on Twitter. They just didn't talk about that because it was an agenda, like always. Going on, it says, this is August 2017, a procession of neo-Nazis and white supremacists marched that day through the city of Charlottesville, right? We all heard this, carrying torches and Confederate flags in a rally called Unite the Right. Torches and flags exactly like you saw right out of the playbook of the Azov Battalion, to make a joke about their Putin playbook. The next day, one of them struck and killed a counter-protester with a car, which became a huge political agenda. The rally was organized in part on Facebook. Why didn't they censor Facebook when that happened? Why didn't they block them all on the account? Because they only do that when they want to. Among its more violent participants, according to the FBI, were members of the Rise Above movement, right? Who later described Azov as the inspiration for the entire thing. Look at that. For many, the violence in Charlottesville was a watershed moment. Exactly. It was meant to be. A brazen display of how white supremacy had entered the political mainstream in the U.S. with implicit support from Donald Trump. That's not true. Implicit implies he was like, I support that. That's not what happened. That's ridiculous. That's like saying Putin threatened nuclear weapons. No, he didn't. You said he meant that, and he didn't actually, at least what I think, but he never said it explicitly. So when you guys say he threatened it, you're just making things up. So too is this. The point was to make Trump the point. So then we think about why it was all meant to be laid at Trump's feet, even though it's directly being created by the U.S. government. Because this is the point. You, America, are the focal point. You're the danger point. You're the domestic terrorist. You're the white supremacist, whether you're an anti-vaxxer or whatever else. It's all been laid together. Quote, we couldn't get any traction about the need to systemically deplatform extremist ideas until Charlottesville. Exactly. So that was when they could decide which ones were bad, which ones were good, and just label anybody any way they wanted to and just pretend that they could delete them, right? It wasn't as clear then, but look at what's happening today. They're just coming right over the top and going, yes, we need to censor. We don't need to justify it. If we think it's hurtful, we're going to remove it. And realize it's not about being hurtful or not. It's about challenging the narrative. And that's all it comes down to. So Charlottesville was an agenda and tied right back to a CIA-grown outfit. The Christchurch mosque attacker, which I said before, live streamed everything on Facebook. Weird. Was it Gab? Was it Parler? No. Of course, I forget whether those places were really there. I forget the timing of when these things. Yeah, 2020. So yeah, definitely there. They claim had been radicalized largely on YouTube and Facebook. And of course, it says during the attack, the shooter wore the jacket wearing the Azov Battalion symbol. Going down here, but activists say it was too late. By allowing groups like Azov to thrive on its platform for years, of course, this after Facebook claimed to stop them, Facebook helped them build a global network that will not be easy to break apart. That's because that's probably the point. The US government was also slow to acknowledge the danger of Ukraine's far-right militias. But by March 2018, the US Congress publicly denounced the Azov Battalion, banning the US government from providing any arms training or assistance to its fighters. Though largely symbolic, the move discouraged all Western military forces, and especially members of the NATO alliance, from training alongside the Azov fighters, or indeed having anything to do with them. The point was, it was symbolic, because that didn't happen. They continue to do so. On the record, by the way, at least as of today. Because we can prove it. They did. They didn't stop doing anything at all. So did they break the law? Yes, they broke their own laws. But at the end of the day, just think about how this can be the case with what they're saying today. To go so far as to say they're so dangerous and so far-reaching that we have to literally pass laws to say that nobody can train with them or use them or work with them, but now we're cheering them on because they're freedom fighters fighting for democracy. Think about how ridiculous that is on a level that people are falling for, to some degree. But again, I don't believe that's everybody. I don't even believe that's the majority. Judging by some of his posts on VK, which is a Russian platform, of course, the point was that they went over to VK because they got censored by the good guys, right? A social network that has grown in popularity among the far right as Facebook has cracked down. My point showing that, guys, is just kind of this transition, as it says, its VK page is 100,000 subscribers hailing from around the world. I know it's subtle, and you know what? I could be wrong. I don't believe so, but my point is that they keep laying these breadcrumbs that were meant, in my opinion, to eventually tie back to some kind of Russian influence. Because, well, the U.S. government showed they weren't going to take it anymore, and so they all went over there. Like, don't forget, they were little crumbs, like letting out that they're all predominantly Russian-speaking. I don't even know why that would actually make sense, seeing as how they're not necessarily from just the east of the country. You know, Donbass, Crimea being the predominantly most Russian-speaking area. It doesn't make sense, does it? Unless there was a reason to make that the case. But in any case, guys, the bottom line is this is from 2021. You just can't see this, hear what they're saying, listen to the far-reaching description, and then listen to today and act like it adds up.